Hello everyone and welcome back once again to my channel and to another CRJ tutorial. I recently got a request in the comment section to make a video on the CRJ Autopilot, so that's exactly what we are going to cover in this tutorial. I'm going to show you the function of every button and knob that controls the Autopilot and go over exactly what they do and when you should use them. Very quickly before we start, make sure you are subscribed to the channel with notifications on so you never miss out on any new upload. If you find this tutorial helpful, don't forget to leave a like as well and tell me down below in the comments what else you would like to see on the channel. And then lastly, a quick shout out to all of the people who have been supporting the channel and the content that I make. I really appreciate it and I love making more videos for you guys. Now without further ado, let's jump into the flight deck. So when you are inside the flight deck, you'll see that the panel which controls the autopilot is located in front and in between the pilots on the glare shield. This panel is called the MCP, which stands for Mode Control Panel. It doesn't only control what the autopilot does, but it also controls what the flight director on the PFD displays. Even if the autopilot is off, you can still use the MCP to manipulate the flight director to get the appropriate guidance. If you look at the primary flight display, you will see that there is some space above the attitude indicator. This space is used to display what modes the autopilot is in. At the moment it is displaying roll and pitch. These are two separate modes. The upper one will always display the lateral or horizontal mode, while the lower one will display the vertical mode. In this case, roll controls the horizontal movement of the aircraft and pitch controls the vertical movement. What these two modes do is they keep the aircraft in its current heading and pitch attitude once the aircraft autopilot is engaged. The aircraft will keep flying in that attitude until another mode is selected on the MCP. These two modes are always selected once you turn on the flight director. Back to the MCP, we are going to start from the left and slowly make our way to the other side of the panel, whilst explaining the function of every knob. Starting with the course knob. With this knob you can adjust the course that you want to follow to a navigate like a VOR or an ILS. This is often used during approaches based on VORs and also during an ILS landing, although this airplane automatically sets the right course for you. Because most airliners have at least two navigation radios, the aircraft will also have two VOR receivers and thus two course knobs to adjust the course of each navigate. The two course knobs are located on either side of the MCP, one for each pilot. Below the course knob you will find a button that says FD. This stands for Flight Director and this simply turns on the system. You can also reset the Flight Director system using this button by turning it on and off again. Then continuing to the right you'll find two buttons related to the autopilot itself. You have the Engage Autopilot and Disconnect button. I think it's quite self-explanatory what these buttons do. You can also bind a key or a button on your yoke or joystick to disconnect the autopilot so you don't need to use the lower button. This can be quite handy during landing or when you need to intervene quickly. Moving on, we have two buttons which I had to look up in the manual myself because I had never used them before. The XFR button, which stands for transfer, is a button that you will probably never use unless you like simulating every failure an aircraft can have. The transfer button is used when there is a failure in the computer that manages the autopilot and flight director. If this type of failure occurs, you can press the transfer button to select another guidance computer, since most aircraft have two of them, so you can still use the autopilot and flight director. Below the transfer button, you will find the turbulence button, which is used during, you guessed it, turbulence. When the air shakes the aircraft around, the autopilot will try to keep the aircraft in exactly the same position, which could result in some rough movements of the aircraft. These rough movements can make the flight even more uncomfortable for the passengers. So to avoid this, you have the turbulence button that, once pressed, eases the movements of the flight controls by the autopilot. Up next are a knob and a button which quote-unquote control the speed of the aircraft, and I say it like that because you need to know something about the CRJ first. It does not have any kind of auto throttle. The only thing it has are a couple of detents on the throttle quadrant, but they do not by any means control the speed of the aircraft. With the lower knob, you can adjust the speed buck on the PFD, and you can set your desired airspeed. By pressing the middle of the knob, you can change between either knots or Mach. The latter will only be used when you're quite high up in the air. When you press the button above the speed knob, the aircraft will pitch the aircraft up or down to keep the right attitude so the aircraft holds at the speed you've selected with the speed knob. Engaging speed mode does not make the throttles move by themselves, it is purely a mode that changes the pitch of the aircraft. If this explanation is still a bit unclear, it will become more clear once I actually demonstrate it later on in the video. Moving to the right once again, we have two separate buttons. Both are used specifically during approaches. The upper one that says APPR, which stands for approach, will make the aircraft follow both the localizer and glide slope during a precision ILS approach. The button below that is the back course button. This is used when you want to follow the localizer for a runway when you've already flown past that runway. I personally never have used this mode, so it's kind of hard for me to demonstrate how it works. Up next are two buttons related to your heading. If you press the upper one, you will engage heading mode and the aircraft will fly the heading that you selected with the knob below the heading button. This is pretty similar to how the speed mode works in this aircraft as I explained earlier. If you press the heading knob in the middle, you can synchronize the heading buck with your current heading. This can be quite handy during flights to ease your workload a little bit. Up next is the nav button. What this button does depends heavily on what nav source the aircraft is using. If you selected the FMS as your desired nav source, the aircraft will follow the flight plan that you've programmed into the FMC. In this case, it's kind of the same as the LNAV button in a Boeing. When you select a different nav source, like the localizer or a VOR that you've tuned in the navigation radio, the aircraft will intercept the course to that nav aid you've selected with the course knob that we talked about earlier. Again, if this is unclear now, it will become more clear momentarily. Below the nav button, you will find a button which says 1/2 bank. What this does is limit the amount of bank the autopilot can use during a turn. This is purely for passenger comfort, just like the turbulence button, and chances are you're never going to use this button since the aircraft automatically engages this mode at a certain point in the flight, and it is automatically turned off once you descend. Then we have another very important set of buttons. The altitude knob is used to select your desired altitude and flight level. A big difference with the heading and speed knob is that when you press the altitude button above the altitude knob, the aircraft won't climb to the altitude you selected with the altitude knob. Instead, it will level off at the altitude you are at currently, regardless of whether it's your cruising altitude or not. This is quite important to know. To the right of the altitude button, you can find the vertical speed button. As the name suggests, this is used to select the rate of climb or descent. To adjust the vertical speed, you use the slider next to the vertical speed button, which says up or down. So you basically have two different modes that both manage the climb or descent of an aircraft. The speed mode and vertical speed mode. Speed mode is always used during the climb, and I personally always used vertical speed during the descent. Both modes have their own pros and cons. If you use vertical speed mode, you can make more accurate adjustments, but then you have to manage the speed yourself. The aircraft won't pitch to maintain your desired airspeed because you've selected a specific rate of climb or descent. So be careful when you use this mode because you could climb at a rate of 3000 feet per minute and your airspeed will start dropping unless you add thrust. With speed mode, you don't have to worry about speed since the aircraft uses that as a reference, but then you can't make very small adjustments, so just keep those things in mind. And that's an overview of the entire MCP panel. Now we'll put what we've learned into practice. So here we are inside the flight deck of the CRJ. We are currently lined up on a runway. Everything is set up and programmed correctly, so let's imagine we've been cleared for takeoff. There is still one button that we need to talk about that has to do with the autopilot system, and that wasn't on the MCP, but that's very important during takeoff. And that's the toga switch on the thrust levers. Before you take off, you need to press this button, and if we now take a look at the space above the PFD, you'll see that it is now displaying TO, both for the lateral and vertical mode. TO obviously stands for takeoff, and in this mode the flight director will give you guidance during the departure. It will have you fly runway heading and keep a certain attitude to allow for acceleration and a decent climb rate. Once you've pressed the toga switch, you're good to go and you can advance the thrust levers. Once you've rotated and reached 600 feet, you can go ahead and turn on the autopilot. The CRJ does like to accelerate quite fast, so as soon as you've reached 200 knots, you can retract the flaps and slats, and you can set the speed back to 250 knots. Once you've reached this speed, you should press the speed button to engage speed mode, and the aircraft will then pitch up to maintain that speed. On the PFD, it will then display climb 250. At this point, you should also engage nav mode, and on the PFD it should display FMS1 in green, provided you've selected the FMS as your nav source. Once you've crossed 10,000 feet, you can set the speed back to your desired climb speed, and the aircraft will automatically pitch down to accelerate to this speed. Once you've been climbing for a while and reached an altitude of around 28,000 feet, it is time to switch from knots to Mach. You do this simply by pressing the middle of the speed select knob, and from that point the aircraft will pitch for the selected Mach speed. Let's imagine that we've reached our top of descent and ATC has cleared us to a lower altitude. To start your descent, you first need to select the altitude ATC has given you, then you press the vertical speed mode and you scroll until you found the ideal rate of descent. Also reduce the thrust at the same time, since the aircraft won't do this by itself. Skipping ahead again, we are now almost at the point where we need to intercept the ILS, so in order to capture it you need to select heading mode first, so the aircraft continues flying in your current direction. Then you can switch the nav source to localizer 1. And once you've done that, you should be able to press nav mode again, but here's an important detail. Notice how localizer 1 is displayed in white instead of green. This means that nav mode is armed and that heading mode is still active. So your aircraft is still maintaining the heading that you've previously selected instead of turning towards the localizer. Once you get close enough to the course you've selected for the localizer, localizer 1 will become green and the heading mode annunciation will disappear, meaning the aircraft will now follow the localizer. Now we are almost ready for landing. The last thing we need to intercept is the glide slope. To do this, you press the approach button on the MCP. On the PFD you will see GS in white, which means it's armed. Once you've intercepted the glide slope, GS will become green and the aircraft will pitch down to follow the glide slope and also the localizer to the runway. And then once you feel comfortable enough with the state of the aircraft, you can disconnect the autopilot and hand fly the aircraft down to the runway. And there we go, that's all you need to know to successfully use the autopilot during a flight. I hope this video was helpful for you guys. If you want me to make a video about some other CRJ systems, you can let me know down below in the comments. And if you like this tutorial, don't forget to leave a like as well. If you do a touch and go on that subscribe button with notifications on, that would be greatly appreciated as well. It would help the channel out tremendously and allow me to teach more people about this beautiful aircraft and aviation in general. But for now, I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.